We are here at Mackenhouse Museum with Floyd Monssen, and it's Wednesday, March 26th. Welcome, Floyd.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I understand that you were born in Coquitlam. Can you tell me about your earliest memories of Coquitlam and the area that you grew up in?
Well, some of the earliest memories was actually from the Hart Street area where we lived. And there was a large rural area there with small farms. And we enjoyed animals. My grandparents had animals of all types. And we were quite busy learning about how to milk cows and ride horses and things like that.
Is there anything else you remember from the farm?
I recall when we had another neighbor that had goats, and they had a mixed farm as well. And they had some baby goats, and they wanted to get rid of some of them. And so they wanted me to buy one, and I bought one of their baby goats for 50 cents from our neighbor, and we kept it for quite a while. I kept it for probably a year or two, until it started getting quite large. And then it started climbing the roof around our house and eating the clothes off my mother's clothesline. And that didn't go over too well. And I had to find a new home for the goat. So I sold it back to the same fellow I bought it from for $1.50. And that was my first venture in business.
So, if you were born in Coquitlam, what about your parents? Were they originally from Coquitlam, or did they come here from some other area of Canada or another country?
My mother was born in Coquitlam as well, and she went to school here. In those days, there was no high school in Coquitlam. She had to go to New Westminster, and the only transportation that she had for that is the streetcar that ran from Fraser Mills to New Westminster. My father, actually, I had originally thought he was born in Norway, but found out that he was actually born in Saskatchewan. And he came out here and worked out here. He worked at Fraser Mills for quite a long time as well.
Could you describe your first house and what it was like? Was there an interior washroom? What was your bedroom furnished like? Did you have lots of toys growing up as a kid in your house?
Our first washroom was actually an outhouse, and so we had to walk outside to go to the washroom, which was kind of cold at times of the year, and wet, but we kind of got used to it. The house was a bungalow type with no basement. The types of toys that we had in those days were probably bought for me to play outside with, like little toy bulldozers and backhoes and things like that.
What types of games were you playing with your childhood friends, either indoor games or outdoor games?
Most of the games that we played were outdoor. I think marbles was probably one of my first ventures, which took up a lot of our time. Another one that I enjoyed was playing with a yo-yo, which we all did at times as well. And at Millside School, we used to walk from Hart Street to Millside. And at that time of the year, it was quite a lot colder in the winter time than it is now. And it wasn't unusual to get 2 feet of snow and then have it freezing and have to walk on top of the snow and the crust of the snow to get to school. Matter of fact, we used to walk right past this area going from Hart Street to Millside School. And there used to be a large aviary behind the Ryan House. And we were very interested in that because they had the exotic birds like peacocks and all different types of birds in there. And it was really quite large, and you could hear the peacocks for blocks away on the way to school. So that was quite unique as well.
As you were growing older, what types of things were you doing for fun? Like as a teenager, were you going skating, swimming, fishing? What types of things was it very popular for a young group of boys to do growing up in Coquitlam?
We used to go fishing at a very young age, and mostly into all the little little streams, and even in the Fraser River at the time. And we used to also go swimming in most of the fishing holes in Coquitlam and swimming holes. There was the Coquitlam River that we went to, the Red Bridge area, but it wasn't really quite deep enough for swimming, but we were able to cool off there quite well in the summertime from the heat. We also went swimming in Burnett Creek. There used to be some dams in that creek, and it was dams that were built by, I think, Greater Vancouver Regional District many, many years ago, and so the water would build up behind them. And one dam, the first dam was called, we called it Minister's Dam. I think we gave it that name because everybody had to wear a bathing suit in that pool. But the second dam, we call it Boys Dam, and that was optional. You could wear your bathing suit or not. The other place that we went swimming was Como Lake, and someone had built a raft up there. We're not sure who built it, but it had a diving board on it, and it was kind of a neighborhood raft. We all kind of got to use it. And one day we were up there swimming, and I dove off this diving board. I went down quite deep. The water was very cold up in the lake, and come up, and there was this huge snake. It was really big. It must have been about at least 3 feet long. And it was green, and it was looking right at me, wondering what I was doing there. Consequently, we never went back.
So you did talk about having a lot of animals that your grandparents had on their farm. Did you have a lot of chores to do to help out around the house, inside chores or outside chores? And what were they? And did you have favorite chores or least favorite chores as well?
We didn't really have a lot of chores to do. We had to clean out the barn occasionally and bring feed to the animals, and milk the cows sometimes. And we had heifers, little young heifers being born from the mother cows occasionally. And when we were kids, we used to, some of the young cows born were bulls as well. And we used to ride these bulls. And that was a lot of fun for us, riding these bulls around the farm. But as far as chores are concerned, we did have some. We had to split fireplace wood and things like that too.
When it comes to school, you mentioned going to Millside School. Could you describe a little bit about what it was like going to school at Millside, and maybe some of your favorite subjects or courses, and then where you attended your high school or middle school?
In Monssen School, I went from grade 1 to grade 6, and we took a series of elementary courses at that time. The school was operating then during the war, during the Second World War, and during physical education, part of our program was learning how to march to the sound of music with wooden rifles. They give us wooden rifles, and they kind of drilled us on how to use them. And the war was over actually in 1945, the VE Day, Victory in Europe, and we did a large V march in the field when the war was coming to an end. That was quite a memory that I have of that school. One thing that we did was during recess and lunch times, there wasn't much activity to do, so we used to have a contest to see who could. There used to be a creek that ran through the south side of Millside School, and we used to run and see who could jump across this creek. And unfortunately, some of the fellows didn't quite make it.
And what about your high school days or your grades after grade 6 once you've finished up at Millside?
I went to the Coquitlam High School on the corner of Austin and Nelson, and we went to, after that I went to Como Lake High School. But the Coquitlam High School was from grade 7 to grade 9, and then they were building a new high school on King Albert Avenue, and we went there from grade 10 to grade 12.
What types of subjects were you taking in school at that time?
The subjects were English and math and sciences and social studies and things along that line.
You mentioned when you were at Millside that was during the war. Do you have any other memories of what the atmosphere was like during the wartime, or if there was any thing that stuck out in your mind during World War II while you were living in Coquitlam?
Yes, the war actually started in 1939, I believe, and I would have been about 5 years old then. And I remember in 1941, when there was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the government of Canada thought at that time that we may be bombed as well. They were concerned about that, so they set a program in for an air raid system, and so they had sirens set up in the City Hall, which was just across the road from here at that time, and in other parts of Coquitlam as well. And we had a curfew where we had to be home by 9 o'clock every night. And the blinds had to be pulled before dark so that no light could come out of the buildings, so that we could get home in time before just around dark and get the blinds pulled and make sure that no light came out, so that we were going by the rules of the government at that time.
Now, on another note, were you involved in any sort of activities or sports growing up? And if so, what were they?
In junior high school, I was involved in track and field, and I did high jumping and through the discus. And we had a lot of track meets here and there in the lower mainland of BC, out in Brockton Oval and the old Empire Stadium in Vancouver, and places like that. And then in high school, in grade 10 to grade 12, I played basketball. I was on the Coquitlam High School basketball team. There was only one high school in Coquitlam at that time. And that was good. I enjoyed that as well.
Could you describe for me a typical family dinner that you would have had growing up with your parents? And also, did you have any siblings growing up? And what was it like growing up with siblings? Were they your friends, or were they more of a nuisance for you?
Well, the actual types of food that we had was very basic, and I think quite often on Sundays we would have a roast beef or a roast pork, and we would eat a lot of chicken and fish dishes. And on special occasions like Christmas, we always had our turkey dinners as well. And some of my siblings were all pretty well the same that way. They all ate the same kinds of food that we did, and we all ate together.
Did you have a favorite holiday? And was your favorite holiday based on the type of food that was served? You can describe Christmases, Easters, birthdays, Valentine's Day, any of your favorite holidays that you'd like to describe for us.
I believe Christmas was my favorite holiday, and types of food as well at that time, with all the variety of foods and the baking that was done, and the turkey and the ham and all the trimmings that went with it. I believe that was probably my favorite time. My mother used to have a favorite dish that she used to make, but not actually for Christmas, and that was mustard pickles. And I think a lot of people did in those days, but we even used to have mustard pickle sandwiches when we went to school, which is kind of different.
Are there any other holidays that you remember celebrating?
Yes, there was Easter. We always had an Easter holiday, an Easter break, and enjoyed that as well with our Easter hunts and Easter eggs and little bunnies and all that type of thing with the occasional chocolate.
What about Valentine's Day? Was that celebrated at school, and was there a card exchange as well?
Yes, there was. There was. The Valentine's Day was actually thought of more, I think, in elementary school in Millside, and there was some card exchanges that we all did too in that regard.
Did you ever make your own cards?
I believe so, yes. I believe we did.
Now, just as a general question, how do you find the world different today than it was when you were growing up? And you can make generalizations about the community or about industry, anything that you see as a big difference between nowadays and the way you lived growing up.
Well, I believe in growing up, it seemed to be a freer time. You weren't tied so much to all of the electronic equipment that we have now, and so we mixed more with people, with our friends, and we enjoyed the geography as well a lot more. It was more wide open, so we could go on hikes and ride our bicycles in many different areas. And we kind of knew more people. We knew more of the people that actually lived in the area then. They used to be more open, I believe.
Now, do you have any information about your surname? So your last name, where it came from?
My father, his last name was spelled a little bit differently than what mine is, and they did that in those days apparently. He came from Norway, and a lot of the people that came over had changed their names slightly, and so that's what was done in that regard.
And do you have any stories about any of your ancestors, or even stories that you can tell us about your mother's generation or your grandparents' generation?
My mother's generation was actually from Michigan, and prior to that they were from Quebec, and then we traced the heritage tree right back to France, going back approximately 500 years. My father's generation was just to Saskatchewan and back to Norway, to Bergen, Norway.
And what types of things would your parents be doing on a regular basis? And you can even talk a little bit about your father's employment as well.
My father did a lot of fishing, and he loved hunting, bird hunting and things like that. Matter of fact, I think he used to go duck hunting down here where the old superstore is now in Coquitlam. My mother was more of a homemaker. She liked cooking and making different kinds of foods and baking as well. And she also liked sewing too.
Do you remember what types of things were grown in your family garden? And were they consumed on a regular basis?
We didn't have a large garden. It was very small, but we grew all sorts of different vegetables like potatoes and beans and tomatoes and cucumbers and things and corn, things along that line. And they were consumed for a certain length of time. But during our very, very young age, there was no refrigerators. They used root houses. So they would go down to the basement and they would dig a hole into the side of the wall further in and then put a door on it. And that was our refrigerator. And then a lot of the vegetables were able to be preserved throughout the whole winter that way.
What do you remember your family enjoying doing together? So what types of things would you have done as a family growing up?
Growing up, we didn't really do a lot of things together. We went to the occasional beach and did some swimming. My grandfather used to love to make an appointment to drive to White Rock, but he would only go if there was a whole big full carload full of people. So we would all get together and go down to White Rock, and he kind of insisted that we all learn how to swim. That was something I'll always remember.
Now, growing up, were you a big fan of music? And if so, were there any special bands or music genres that you listened to frequently?
We liked a lot of different types of music when we were kids. I believe the first interest in music probably came when I was in my early teens, along with my friends. And we would enjoy some of the people like in those days. Johnny Ray was one of our favorites, and he sang, I think Cry was one of my songs that I liked the best. And then there was Teresa Brewer, who was quite famous in the early 50s, or around 50. And she sang music, which was quite nice. We liked that a lot. There was Patti Page, who was very popular in those days. And she sang a song like Tennessee Waltz, which was quite a hit for us during those days. And Louis Armstrong was really interesting as well, because he could sing and he could also play the trumpet quite well too. So we enjoyed him as well.
And were you listening to these artists on the radio or through other means?
No, it was usually in a jukebox and on recordings that we would buy. But we would go down to our little restaurant and sit in a booth and put our nickel in the Nickelodeon and play some of these songs at that time.
And what were the most popular restaurants that you and your friends and relatives would have gone to?
There was one not too far from here, actually. It's not there anymore because that was a few years ago, but it was called the Paris Cafe. And we used to meet there quite a bit. And they had jukeboxes and little booths, and we used to spend a lot of time in there drinking pop and playing music and so forth and singing.
No dancing?
Yes, but a little later we did some dancing in a little later years, probably in our getting into our middle teens and late teens. we used to go to a dance in New Westminster, which was very popular. It was called the hall was called the Hollywood Bowl, and it was shaped like a bowl on the inside, and it was built with horsehair underneath the actual wood floor. There was horsehair under it, and so that when you danced on it, it gave you more spring, and it was quite unique. It was quite different, and they had a stage on a higher up balcony all the way around the top of the outside of the Hollywood Bowl, and we would meet there and go dancing. That's where I met my wife, actually.
So you mentioned that you would pass by this area where Mackin House is now on your way to school every day at Millside. Could you describe to the best of your ability what Mackin House and this area looked like back then?
Well, the Mackin House and the township of Fraser Mills was all intact at that time. There was all of the whole town site that was had all the homes and all the people living there, and we would walk past this area, and the street came right up through. At that time, King Edward came right through the where the parking area is here now, where the large Canadian Western Lumber sign is. And then there was wood tramways on both sides going down into Fraser Mills. And Mackin lived here, and Mr. Ryan lived across the road where Plastids Arts is now. And we used to walk past this area, and a little further down there was a little beaver farm. There was a creek that used to run through the area, and there was a dam that the beavers built. And they had all kinds of beavers in that area, and we used to stop there and just kind of, really enjoy watching them. And down in Millside School, when we got down there, the creek that ran through that school in those days, during the fall, during the spawning season, would just be full of salmon. And that was something that you don't see today in those small creeks. Quite a change.
You mentioned to me before the interview that you know a little bit about the history of polio hitting this area. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, there was a polio epidemic that struck Canada. Apparently, from what I understand, it struck Europe first, then came to Canada, and spread across the country, and there was quite a few people from Coquitlam that were struck with polio, and they were kind of handicapped in different ways because of the way that it struck. It was an epidemic that came on mostly around 1952, I believe, and they had the vaccine that came out in 1954, which was a kind of a godsend because it was a very destroying thing for a lot of young people, particularly. I knew people that were struck with it and that had to go into an iron lung, for an example, at the Vancouver General Hospital, and they're paraplegics. And they're still living though. And that was, they're about the same age as I am. They're doing fine.
Could you describe what an iron lung is?
It was a round metal encased thing with a vacuum inside that were to help the people breathe and function.
Could you tell us a little bit about your employment throughout the years, the types of companies that you worked for, and the areas of Coquitlam that you worked at?
Yes, I think my very first job was probably delivering newspapers, and then I got a job at a machine shop in New Westminster during the summer holidays one year, and I believe I was paid the big amount of 60 cents an hour in those days. which I thought was pretty good at that time. And then a little later in high school, I worked at Fraser Mills. They would hire people to work there on weekends while they were going to school. And that was a good thing for us at the age of about 15 years and on. So those were some of the jobs that we did. And prior to that, actually, I used to help my grandfather. I think I was about 10 or 12 years old. And he had horses, and he used to build houses, but and he cleared the land with the horses. And I would be there right up on the side hill over here in Coquitlam. And we would cut the logs down, and there was no such thing in those days as chainsaws. We had to do it by hand with a crosscut saw, and we'd fall the trees and get the logs ready and pull them all out with a horse, and then the stumps would be left. And so if we couldn't pull the stump out with a horse, we would use an apparatus called a block and tackle, which was a kind of a big block like a pulley, where the cables used to run through, and that would be pulled by the horse as well between the stump and the horse, and that was put in to increase the leverage of pulling on the stump with the horse, and quite often that would work, and that would pull the stump out. But in the occasional situation, that didn't work, and so and then my grandfather had to get the what he called stumping powder. He'd dig a hole under the stump and put whether a half a stick or a whole stick of the stumping powder in, and then put a cap on the end of it, and run a line a wire line to behind some safety area, behind another tree or another stump or something, and move the horses well out of the way as well, and then holler that he was going to be doing this, and try and let everybody know. And then he would hook the wire up to a battery in behind this hiding area that we were at. And then he had me one time give it a try, which I thought was very exciting. I would push the plunger on the battery, and as I was doing it, I could see the stump kind of lift up out of the ground immediately. So that was quite exciting.
Could you go on and describe any other jobs that you had later on, even in life, including your work in the gravel business?
Yes, after I graduated from high school, I took some other courses in continuing education, and I worked for a company in New Westminster, which was a civil engineering company and land surveying, and I had worked for them on many different large subdivisions in Coquitlam. We built actually the Harbor Chines subdivision, Glen Eyre subdivision, and the Ranch Park, some of the major ones at that time. That would have been probably in the mid to late 50s. And then after that, I went into business for myself and formed a company in 1959 and got into the sand and gravel business and then into construction. And we did construction projects pretty well throughout all of the Lower Mainland and some on Vancouver Island as well. Projects like building subdivisions, large subdivisions, putting in all of the utilities, like the storm sewer, sanitary sewer, water, street lighting, underground wiring, and the paving and the concrete curbs and concrete sidewalks, that type of thing. And we also did other jobs, like we rebuilt the Langley Airport for the federal government. And while I was out there, I recall in around 1965, I believe that was, every day I went out to see how they were doing, and I took a lesson in flying. So when I got the airport built, I also got my pilot's license at the same time. So it wasn't a waste of time going out there. We had worked at UBC as well, We had done the first contract out there on the cyclotron Triumph site, UBC, while it was being built. We did the excavation for it and the dewatering, and then some site work and around there too, and then some work for the Asian Center out at UBC, and many other projects as well.
Sounds like you were very busy.
Yeah, it was a busy time.
Could you talk about your experience as a kinsman and what that organization was all about?
Yes, I was in the Kinsman for a number of years. I believe I joined in approximately 1957 or 58, and we did all sorts of different projects. They did a lot of charitable work. One of the projects I recall was funding the first tennis court, which was also a play area over in Mackin Park, and that was somewhere in the area of around 1959 to 1961 area. And then we quite often would help along with some of the people that had polio too. We would sometimes get a group together, and I would draw the plans for a wheelchair ramp, and we would go down to Riverdale Lumber, which was down here on Burnett Street at that time, pick up the lumber on a Saturday with a pickup truck and prearrange all this and go out to the people's home and build a wheelchair ramp for them. And we've done that in at least 2 occasions that I recall. We did all sorts of other types of projects, fundraising. We had a kind of a format where we would try and discover what was the community's greatest need at the time. Another greatest need was the ambulance. Coquitlam didn't have an ambulance then, and so we funded their first ambulance. It was called an inhalator at that time, and it cost a big chunk of $8,500, with a difference from what it would cost today.
You touched on it briefly, but are there any other world events that impacted your life here in Coquitlam growing up, either personally or economically?
Another project that I was in the organization called, during the polio time, there was a foundation that was formed, and the name of it was the BC Child Care and Polio Foundation, and I represented Coquitlam at the board meetings in Vancouver, and the funds would be collected by them and distributed by the people that needed the funds for different things. And that was a very difficult decision to try and make as to who should get funding for certain things. You know, everything from shoes to crutches to wheelchairs and so forth. I'll always remember that as well.
Are there any other things that you'd like to add to this interview? Any memories from the past that you'd like to have preserved? Now is your chance to speak about it.
Not that I can recall, just offhand. I'll probably think of them when I'm finished, but that's usually part.
Did you want to consult your notes? I know you brought some notes with you.
Well, one thing I should maybe mention is that the costs of some things have dramatically changed, and for some of the reasons that they have done so, especially in housing and in I recall when my grandfather would clear the land, he would go to the nearest lumber yard. There was a lot of different small mills around too, and some of the logs would be delivered to the small sawmills and cut into lumber for him on a custom basis, and he'd get it back, and we would use it to build a house with. So there was no waste and no middleman type of thing. So we would also dig basements for these homes with scrapes, with a scraper pulled by a horse, and you'd hold the two handles of the scraper. It was a metal scraper, and you'd go down, and the horse would go ahead of you, and you would have to hang on to the handles of the scraper, so you weren't able to hang on to the reins of the horse. So you put the reins around your neck, and you'd have hopefully taught the horse how to move to the right or the left with a G to the right and a haw to the left. And you'd bring the scraper down and you'd scoop out the ground, move it along and dump it up off the other side. And hopefully you didn't hit a rock, because if you hit a big rock, you'd end up going flying over the top of the scraper if you didn't let go of the handles. Those were sometimes I'll remember too, probably for a long time. Another thing about getting back to housing and costs, in our day, you could build a pretty nice home, a bungalow, for about $6,000. And now that same home would probably cost about $600,000. And I believe that a lot of the reasons for it is on the servicing of the land, not the wages or the materials, because the materials have gone up during that period of time about 10 times. But the serviced land has gone up more substantially due to the servicing. And in those days, all you needed to do in order to build a house was, like in a subdivision, is put in the roads and have a water system. There was no sewer, so you had a septic tank. And these days, now to build a subdivision, you've got to put in all these services that I mentioned earlier, which substantially increase the cost of the lots and the serviced land. So I think that's where the larger percentage of the increases came.
I'm actually curious, could you describe what the area of Schoolhouse and Brunette looked like when you were going to school at Millside?
We used to, when we walked across the area, there was a lot of orchards, small orchards, and there was a vineyard that was just down the street, not too far from here. I think the names were Tabors, that had this vineyard, and a lot of the grapes would hang over the fence. So that was kind of handy for us going to school. And then a little further along, there was some people that had some peach trees. And the occasional peach used to fall down on the ground and roll down on the sidewalks that we picked up on the way to school, which was kind of nice. And a little further along, there was some fields in Booth Farm. They had a large dairy farm at that time. And Ralph Booth was the mayor of Coquitlam, I believe, from around 1904 to 1907. And Millside School was built in 1907. So I'm not sure if he had anything to do with the school being built right close to his farm or not, but it's possible that he did, because the Millside School was quite a little ways away from the actual town site of Fraser Mills. People had to walk quite a ways from the town site of Fraser Mills to go to Millside School. Whereas if the school was built where it was, at Schoolhouse and Burnett, the kids from working in Booth Farm wouldn't have to walk very far to get to school.
Did you ever visit Booth Farms for a picnic at all at any time?
No, I didn't. That was before my time. I remember, though, that people have told me that there was some really large picnics that there was down near the Booth Farm area, and I've seen photos of them where there's, probably hundreds of people go to these picnics, which was quite interesting.
And do you remember any fads from your generation? Any popular clothing styles, hairstyles?
In the as far as men is concerned, yes, we used to have haircuts we call crew cuts in those days. It would be flat on the top and kind of stick straight up, but it was flat and short, and then the sides would be a little bit longer, and the clothes would be fingertip length sport coat and corduroy sport coats, and with pants with tight bottoms on the at the bottom of your pants, and baggy knees, and things like that. And kind of, I guess in some days, some people used to call them zooters, but we didn't call them that. That was just a fad.
Are there any final remarks that you have about Coquitlam's past and anything that you'd like to mention from your memories?
I believe that I've covered pretty well everything that I have to say in that regard. It's been a very interesting interview, and I've mentioned a lot of what I had in mind, and I'm very pleased that you asked all the questions that you did, because it kind of brought back a lot of old memories too.
Actually, just one final thing that I thought of. When you used to walk along Brunette Avenue, were there any shops or restaurants or stores that you remembered along Brunette?
Yes, there was a few. Further down on Burnett, there was a hardware store, and Lougheed Highway wasn't built yet, and there was a bulldozing company across the road. It was called Leon Perry was the person's name, and he had these bulldozers, and he was clearing land in the area, and that was during the baby boom years of the early 50s. That's when the largest boom was in the housing in Coquitlam. And then coming this way, there was a couple of different stores. There was Trev's, that was just across the road here on an angle, right close to the City Hall. And then further down there was a pet store. And then across the road that was on the south side of Burnett. And on the north side there was Thrifts. They were both grocery stores. I don't know how they were able to make it, but they seemed to do fine. And then there was a little commercial strip, small commercial strip on the corner of Laval, on the corner of Burnett, Laval, on the northwest corner. And in there was a shoemaker called Graveling Shoemakers, and his name was John Graveling. And he used to make, when I was working with this engineering company, surveying engineering company, he used to make me boots. He used to first make my lass for me, so that he could make my boots from the lass. And then he would build them just exactly the way you wanted them. And they were the best boots that I ever had. And people all wondered where I got these nice boots from that I was working with. And I told him, and then he got a lot more business from these people too. So he was great. He finally moved out of there, though, into an area in Sapperton. But those are some of the memories. Another memory that I have going further along Burnett Street, on the corner of Schoolhouse Road and Burnett, would be the northwest corner. I believe the house is still there. It's called the Braille House. The road that's in there now, the new road, is called Marathon Court. It's a short street that runs off Burnett, but the house is still there. And the original owner was a person by the name of Albert Braille. And I believe that home is the oldest house in Coquitlam, and it was built, I think, in 1898. That was something that's close to home here. And the next oldest house, I believe, was the Booth House, and I understand that was built in around 1904. from what I recall.
Did you ever frequent Trev's or Thrift's store or the pet store?
Yes, yes, we had. We used to buy items from them occasionally.
So now I'm going to open up questions to the cameramen to see if they have any burning questions for you.
Peanut gallery questions.
Pardon?
Peanut gallery questions. Anything of the...
Do you recall when the Fraser would freeze over below the Patella Bridge? I can recall in the newspaper a car driving across it.
I heard that. I've heard they even walked teams of horses across the Fraser River when it was frozen. But that was just a story that I got from my grandparents. But I believe it's true. I believe that the Fraser used to freeze over a lot way back when it was colder.
Maybe drawing upon your own experiences and wintertime being a little more severe in those days, we did have people talk about skating on the local ponds and things like that as well.
Yes. That's true, yes. And during 1948, you probably are quite aware of the flood at that time on the Fraser River, and it destroyed a lot of buildings and other lands of different types. And I recall going to the flood areas in Fraser Mills with my father. I think I was about 14 then, and we would fill sandbags and help them wherever we could. And then in 1968, there was a Fraser River flood control agreement that was formed between the different senior levels of government, and they embarked on a diking project, and let contracts out for many different areas of diking, and they reinforced them, they raised them, and they reinforced them all up and down the Fraser River, and particularly in Richmond and up around the Pitt Meadows area. We had 2 contracts with them, one for about 7.5 miles of dike in Richmond, and another one for over 3 miles of dike in Pitt Meadows.
And do you recall Gilly Brothers?
Yes, I do. Yes, they were in New Westminster, and they had the Gillies Quarry up on Quarry Road in Coquitlam on the Pitt River. And they had the rock that they would blast and haul out of there and haul it down by barge down to their depot in Port Moody. They also had a gravel pit and a Maryhill bypass right near the road there at that time, and they would haul gravel out of there. But Gilly Brothers had a kind of a building supply depot in New Westminster where they sold all types of things.
And what about the interurban?
No, I don't recall that. That was before my time.
No, it was still there.
But I didn't use it. My mother used it, but I didn't really actually use it myself.
Maybe your earliest memories of North Road, what North Road would have been like in your youth?
Yes, it was just kind of like a cow trail type of thing. It was a road, but I guess from what I understand, it was just used for an access road built by the Royal Engineers that came over here in the mid-1800s to be able to escape from where they were set up in Sapperton to get to the Broad Inlet because I guess they thought that they might be invaded by the Americans at that time, and also the Indians were bothering them a fair amount too. When they were down at Sapperton, they were being raided occasionally by the occasional First Nations people who used to come down and raid some of their stuff, and then they had a bit of a contest going. They were raiding each other, from what I understand by some of the archives in New Westminster. It showed pictures of the canoes out there on the Fraser River, and North Road was a bit of an access to get away from that situation in case it got worse, as well, to get over to the barred inlet that didn't freeze because it was salt water.
So the earlier days then of Port Moody, would you say then the most, like, would people not use that road necessarily? That if you were just living in Coquitlam, would you take North Road to go, or were there other routes to get down to Port Moody at that time?
Well, in Port Moody, we would take North Road would be the way that we would go, yes. And Burnett Street. Those are kind of the two of the main streets at that time. There was some arterial roads built by the rail engineers going way back into the early 1900s.
And touching on events, do you recall anything around May Days? Usually was a fairly big event.
Yes, we did have a May Day. It was something that originally, when I was in Millside, we went to the May Day in New Westminster. It was the one that we attended because there wasn't one in Coquitlam yet. And that was quite interesting. We would go to Queen's Park, and we would have sports day there, and May Days and the maypole dances and all that type of thing. And then when Coquitlam discovered that they would want to have their own May Day, we would practice doing maypole dancing at Millside School and for weeks, and then have a little parade that we went on our parade up from Millside School to Blue Mountain Park, which was quite a trek up that steep hill for quite a ways, and it was pretty warm in those days as well at that time of the year in May, and go up there and do have a competition type of thing doing the maypole dance. Yeah, it was interesting. We did all types of different things up there at Blue Mountain Park during May Day. And they had the May Queen, and some of the people that I know from May Queen, Dolly Bow was one of the May Queens while I was in Millside School. She was from Fraser Mills, actually. And the reason that I remember her is because she was from the same school that we were from. And in order to run for May Day, you had to be a member of the school in Coquitlam, but you could be picked out of any school. And they had a different May Day every year, and a different May Queen every year.
Do you happen to recall, I guess you weren't really involved in the process, but I know someone brought it up, they weren't sure how that process happened, how they picked the May Queen, because there were a couple of different schools. Was it one school assigned a year to pick the May Queen, or was it whoever they picked from all 3 or 4
Well,
schools?
my understanding was that it was picked from all the different schools. It was voted on by all the different schools, from what I understand, for one May Queen, from whatever school that May Queen was elected from. I was also quite involved with the initial Coquitlam Heritage Society, and we formed the society back in 1984, and the reason was that there was a historical society here prior, which was called the Coquitlam Historical Society, and they folded up, they disbanded, and they joined forces with the Port Moody Historical Society, and that left a void in Coquitlam. So a few of us got together, and this would have been around about 1981 or so, and we met as concerned citizens because there was nobody really representing Coquitlam for heritage at that time. And we kind of lobbied the city of Coquitlam councillors quite a bit, and to try and get them interested more in the history of Coquitlam. And so we were told that we should, by one of the councillors, that we should actually form a society. And so we got a constitution together. We started to pick a name. There was a lot of different names bandied about. Some people wanted the Millardville Heritage Society and all different types of names. But we finally decided that on the Coquitlam Heritage Society, and that was to represent all of Coquitlam, not just a part of Coquitlam. And we formed the society in September of 1984. So it'll be 30 years this September that it'll have been formed. And then we continue to lobby the city of Coquitlam, along with the people from Places Arts and the Coquitlam Railway Historical Association and other organizations that were interested in heritage, on the development of the Heritage Square. And we finally got the council interested enough to go ahead in phases. And there was 4 different phases to build the Coquitlam Heritage Square. There was a funding campaign that was introduced at that time by council as well. And they hired a consultant firm to do that. And people could donate towards it. And so I was on the original committee of the Coquitlam Heritage Square and the Mackin House Restoration Committee too. So that was quite interesting. It was good that we got them to go ahead and preserve some of Coquitlam's history at that time. And now I see they're still doing it. There's still a lot of pressure on for them to continue to do this, which is good because a lot of the old buildings are being torn down and there's nothing to show of our past. So I'm quite pleased at the progress that's being made. I know they've started to preserve the Booth House, the Perry House, and the Allard House across the street. And so that's all a really good start.
A bit off topic from what we're doing here, but seeing as we have you hostage, what are your thoughts on, I know Jill is anxious, has kind of intimated it'd be a good idea to have an actual museum. That the house is a great heritage house, but like Port Moody has a museum to their history, that Coquitlam should have a similar kind of facility with, you know, more museum type features. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I believe that the house as a heritage house is great. With all the artifacts that are available and the people wanting to contribute in that regard, I believe that there needs to be a larger building for that. And as far as the location is concerned, that's optional. There's different views in mind in that regard, in that respect too. It has to be a location that's fairly central to the people and for access. I understand that a part of the Evergreen building in the Coquitlam Town Center area may be available for that, and that's a good option. I believe that the Mackin House, though, and the Heritage Square should still stay intact and be used for the different functions that it has been used for.
Thank you very much, Floyd.